What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 21 of the Black Massacre Series, where today I will be talking about the Ocoee Massacre of 1920. The Ocoee Massacre was a mass racial violence event that saw a white mob attack numerous black residents in the northern parts of Ocoee, Florida, a town located in Orange County near Orlando. The massacre took place on November 2nd, 1920, the day of the U.S. presidential election. By most estimates, a total of 30 to 35 black people were killed in the violence. Most black-owned buildings and residences in northern Ocoee were burned to the ground. Other blacks living in southern Ocoee were later killed or driven out of town by the threat of further violence being used against them. Thus, Ocoee essentially became an all-white or sundown town. The massacre has been described as the single bloodiest day in modern American political history. The attack was intended to prevent black citizens from voting. Black people had essentially been disenfranchised in Florida since the beginning of the 20th century. In Ocoee and across the state, various black organizations had been conducting voter registration drives for a year. In November 1920, Mose Norman, a prosperous black farmer, tried to vote but was turned away twice on election day. Norman was among those working on the voter drive. A white mob surrounded the home of Julius July Perry, where Norman was thought to have taken refuge. After Perry drove away the white mob with gunshots, killing 2 men and wounding one who tried to break into his house, the mob called for reinforcements from Orlando in Orange County. The mob laid waste to the black community in northern Ocoee and eventually killed Perry. They took his body to Orlando and hanged him from a light post to intimidate other black people. Norman escaped, never to be found. Hundreds of other blacks fled the town, leaving behind their homes and possessions. Most of the people living in Ocoee don't even know that this happened there, said Pamela Schwartz, chief curator of the Orange County Regional History Center, which sponsored an exhibit on it. For almost a century, many descendants of survivors were not aware of the massacre that occurred in their hometown. Orange County, as well as the rest of Florida, had been politically dominated by Southern white Democrats, also known as Dixiecrats, since the end of Reconstruction. But in the weeks leading up to the presidential election of 1920, blacks throughout the South were registering to vote in record numbers. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a revival and had established many new chapters since 1915. 3 weeks before Election Day, the KKK warned the black community that not a single Negro would be permitted to vote. Judge John Moses Chaney, a Republican running for the United States Senate from Florida, had started a voter registration campaign to register blacks to vote in Florida because they had supported the Republican Party since Reconstruction. Mose Norman and July Perry, both prosperous black landowners in Ocoee, led the local voter registration efforts in Orange County, paying the poll tax for those who could not afford it. In an effort to preserve white one-party rule, the Ku Klux Klan marched in full regalia through the streets of Jacksonville, Daytona, and Orlando to intimidate opponents. The organization threatened Judge Chaney prior to the election. Sam Salisbury was a police chief in Orlando, Florida. A native of New York, Salisbury served in the U.S. military and was known as Colonel Sam Salisbury. A white supremacist and a member of the Ku Klux Klan, Salisbury bragged about his involvement in the violent oppression and intimidation of blacks attempting to vote in the previous 1920 election. He was one of the leaders of the events leading up to the Ocoee Massacre. He was injured in an attack he led on July Perry's home in Ocoee. Blacks were met with resistance from the white community when they attempted to vote on Election Day. Poll workers challenged whether black voters were really registered. The voters had to prove they were registered by appearing before the notary public, R.C. Bigelow, who was regularly sent on fishing trips so that he was impossible to find. However, blacks, including Mose Norman, persisted but were pushed and shoved away from the polls. Norman contacted Judge John Chaney, who told him that interference with voting was illegal and told him to write the names of the blacks who were denied their constitutional rights, as well as the names of the whites who were violating them. Norman later returned to the polling place in Ocoee with a shotgun. Whether the shotgun was taken from Norman is not entirely clear, but whites at the polls drove off Norman using his own shotgun. The white community began to form a mob and paraded up and down the streets, growing more disorderly and unmanageable. The rest of the blacks gave up on trying to vote and left the polling place. Later during the evening, Sam Salisbury, the former chief of police of Orlando, was called to lead a lynch mob to find and punish Mose Norman. He later proudly bragged about his part in the events. The white mob was on its way to Norman's home when someone informed him that their target had been seen at the home of July Perry. The mob, by then numbering about 100 men, arrived at Perry's home demanding that Perry and Norman surrender. When they received no answer, they attempted to break down the front door. Perry, who had been warned about the mob, fired gunshots from inside the home in self-defense. Exactly how many people were defending the house is uncertain. The whites estimated that there were several armed blacks. Zora Neale Hurston wrote that Perry had defended his home alone. Sam Salisbury knocked the back door open and was shot in the arm, becoming the first white casualty. Two other whites, veterans Elmer McDaniels and Leo Beauregard, were killed when they also tried to enter through the back door. Their bodies were found hours later in the backyard. The white mob withdrew and put out a call for reinforcements to whites in Orlando, Apopka, and Orange County, either calling them by phone or sending them by car. During the 2 to 3 hour lull, while the whites were recruiting other men, July Perry, injured in the conflict, attempted to flee with the help of his wife into a cane patch. He was found by the white mob at dawn and arrested. After Perry was treated at a hospital for his wounds, he was taken by a white mob from a vehicle while being transferred to jail. They lynched him and left his body hanging from a telephone post beside the highway. Norman was never found. Much of the trouble was attributed to outsiders from Winter Garden in Orlando. With reinforcements, the white mob took the conflict to the rest of the black community in northern Ocoee. The white paramilitary forces surrounded the northern Ocoee black community and laid siege to it. They set fire to rows of black houses. Those inside were forced to flee, and many were shot by whites. At least 20 buildings were burned in total, including every black church, schoolhouse, and lodge room in the vicinity. Black residents fought back in an evening-long gunfight lasting until as late as 4:45 a.m. Their firearms later found in the ruins after the massacre ended. Eventually, black residents were driven into the nearby orange groves and swamps, forced to retreat until they were driven out of town. The fleeing sought refuge in the surrounding woods or in the neighboring towns of Winter Garden and Apopka, which had substantial populations of black people. The siege of Ocoee claimed numerous black victims. Lang Maid, a black carpenter, was beaten and castrated. Maggie Ginlack and her pregnant daughter died while hiding in her home. Their bodies were found partially burned underneath it. Roosevelt Barton, a black hiding in July Perry's barn, was shot after the mob set fire to the barn and forced him to flee. Hattie Smith was visiting her pregnant sister-in-law in Ocoee when her sister-in-law's home was set on fire. Smith fled, but her sister-in-law family was killed while they hid and waited for help that never came. The black residents of southern Ocoee, while not direct victims of the massacre, were later threatened into leaving. Annie Hemmeter, a black woman residing in southern Ocoee, sometimes referred to as Mrs. J.H. Hemmeter, suspected that the massacre was planned so that whites could seize the property of prosperous blacks for nothing. According to Hemmeter, people in southern Ocoee were coerced by the threat of being shot and burned out if they did not sell out and leave. About 500 black people in total were rapidly driven out of Ocoee, resulting in its population being nearly all white. That fall, white residents had to work to harvest the citrus crop because black laborers had fled the region. No black residents had settled there again until 61 years later in 1981. July Perry's body was found riddled with bullets and swinging on a telephone pole post by the highway, according to the Chicago Defender. His body was left near a sign reading, "This is what we do to niggers that vote." Another source has said he was hanged near the home of a judge who supported the black voter franchise. A local photographer was selling photos of Perry's body for 25 cents each. Several stores placed the photo on exhibition by their windows. No one was prosecuted for his murder. Perry's wife, Estelle Perry, and their daughter were wounded during the shooting at their home, but survived. The authorities sent them to Tampa for treatment in order to avoid further disturbance. Walter White of the NAACP arrived in Orange County a few days after the riot to investigate events. He was traveling undercover as a white northerner interested in buying orange grove property in the county. He found that the whites that there were still giddy with victory. A local real estate agent and a taxicab driver told him that about 56 blacks were killed in the massacre, while White's NAACP report recorded around 30 dead. A Methodist pastor, Reverend J.A. Long, and a Baptist minister, Reverend H.K. Hill, both from Orlando, reported that they had heard of 35 black deaths in Ocoee as a result of the fires and shooting. Charles Coe in 1970 described 12 dead. A University of Florida student who interviewed local residents for a history term paper claimed in 1949 that about 30 to 35 murdered is the most common estimate of the old-timers. The exact number could never be determined. White also learned that many black residents thought the massacre was due to the white community's jealousy of prosperous blacks such as Norman and Perry. No one was ever held responsible for any of the deadly violence. Agents of the Bureau of Investigation, later known as the FBI, showed up a few weeks later, but they made it clear they weren't investigating murder, arson, or assault. They were only interested in election fraud. The leader of the mob became mayor of Ocoee. Supporters urged the House Action Committee of Congress to investigate the riot and voter suppression in Florida with a view to suing under the 14th Amendment, but it failed to act. This concludes this week's episode of the Black Massacre Series, episode 21 on Ocoee, Florida. Let me know down in the comments, have you ever heard of this massacre before? If you have you learned anything new? And if you have not, if this is your first time hearing about it, how interesting was this to you? Also be sure to check out the Black Massacre Series playlist so you can get caught up on all the episodes that have been displayed so far, or just to get a recap. And be sure to tune back in next Wednesday when we do episode 22 of the Black Massacre Series. Be safe and be one.